welcome all. And thanks for coming this morning. This is a bit of a diversion for the UNC conference to spend a whole day focused on WASH in high-income countries, a newer topic for many of us. And so welcome and thanks for being part of this great experiment that we're having. And I've been really encouraged by the interest in WASH in high-income countries and look forward to sharing the next hour with you, the next 2 hours with you. Some of you may peel off and go to another room, the second half, or you'll stay here with us. It'll be a really good session. So first and foremost, I am Kimberly Lemmy. I work with DIGDEEP. I lead our research and innovation work. DIGDEEP is a human rights focused organization that works on WASH in the US because lo and behold, here in the United States, we have well over 2 million Americans who live without any access to water. Those of you who are in the session this morning with the administrator of the EPA, he was sharing with us, we have lots of neighbors who don't have access, or who do have access, but sometimes quality is an issue. For those of you who don't work in the US context, there are plenty of places in this country that are never going to be on centralized systems. So this session, for the next 2 hours, we're going to talk about both the technologies and opportunities for new technologies on decentralized water or wastewater systems. And the second hour will be focused on some of the challenges and some of the obstacles and some of the things that are happening to get those technologies into a setting that works. What is the whole system and the enabling environment that is needed to get that system working over the long term to make sure that services are reliable for all of us, those of us who live in cities or on centralized systems, but we have lots of neighbors who are rural and won't ever be on centralized systems because laying a main pipe for miles and miles and miles for 5 households may or may not ever make economic sense. So we have great panelists today. I will let them each introduce themselves before they speak. But we're going to spend the next hour kind of going through what some of those technologies are. There are new ones emerging every day. But this will give you a little flavor of some of the things that are being used as options for places in the country that are not going to be on a central system. So I'm going to move my slide. Great. As I said, everyone will introduce themselves. Really looking forward. We'll get a smattering of technology ideas, and then we'll have some question and answer. So as you come up with questions, make a note. We will have Q&A at the end. So a smattering, I say, 3 different parts of the country is where DIGDEEP currently works in community-led projects. I will go quickly over our work with the Navajo Water Project because my colleague Troy will go into more detail of the work that happens there and what the off-grid solutions look like there. But essentially, as you can see in this little map here, the Navajo Nation sits across 3 US states, Arizona, New Mexico, and a little bit of Utah. And there's no central system in much of those areas. So we provide home water systems. Troy will go into the technology of that. We do a little bit of rainwater harvesting, which looks very similar to other parts of the world with rainwater harvesting. We help with bathroom installations, septic cleanouts. In the Colonias along the Texas border, there are pockets of land that don't fall within any one water or wastewater district. And so we work with existing utilities to expand their boundaries, and we work with those households and those utilities and the local government to ensure that people who are living in those donut holes, in those spots where there is no connectivity, we help get them connected. We also work with septic, which is a great offline option. And right nearby here in North Carolina, we work in West Virginia, so not too far. The Appalachian Water Project. There's lots of water there. There's not a lot of infrastructure that is functioning. And so we are working with rainwater harvesting. There's lots of hills in Appalachia, lots of hollers, as they're called. People who live on top of the ridge, it's hard to get them system. So get them connected to a main line. Sometimes we connect them to a main line. Sometimes we work on connecting them with a rainwater harvesting system so they have on-site water. I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Sarah Beck from the University of British Columbia to take it away and talk about the interesting work that you're working on.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, so I am an American living in Canada, where we have a lot of the same issues that you just mentioned, and particularly in First Nations communities. So waterborne disease incidence rates are 26 times higher than the general population, and in Indigenous communities, they are 90 times more likely to not have access to running water than the general population. So these are some of the things that we're encountering there. And in the introduction this morning, we heard from Erin that a lot of what we do in the WASH sector, and particularly with this conference, is first we identify the problems, and then we identify potential solutions, and then we look at evaluating the solutions in the environment where they are needed, and then disseminating them. And so a lot of what I do is in between those, I guess, the second and third. So we know what the problems are, lack of access and lack of viable treatment technologies, and then we are evaluating the technologies in the lab and then also in pilot scales and around the world. So I wanted to give you an introduction to some of the technologies that we're incorporating, and this is one of them. This is a passive gravity-driven membrane filtration system. This is one that was installed at the Hupatchisat First Nation on Vancouver Island near a town called Port Alberni. And this was developed by a colleague of mine, Dr. Pierre Berube. We've been evaluating it for the past 3 years. So it's gravity-driven membrane filtration, which we've heard about in the industry now. What's unique about this one is the passive component of it. So there's an air sparging component. So every 24 hours, we drain the system of water, and then like you have when you invert a water bottle, for example, you've got bubbles that go up, and so that's removing the biofilm layer, and that's enabling us to have a more consistent permeate or more consistent flux. We still get high removal of everything we need, turbidity, viruses even, and also total coliform and E. coli. So this system, basically we've got a setup in the size of a trailer, and we've got four membrane modules. Oh, it switched sides, sorry about that. 4 hollow fiber membrane modules that are treating surface water from the Sproat River nearby. So we did this for 3 years, treating the water and then adding chlorine to meet the regulations. So we need to have a residual at the households. This is for treating water for 10 households. And it has been working very well with little to no maintenance. So we have an operator who comes and checks in on it, I think about once a week, and I can cover some of the issues that have come up, but they've been very minimal. The amount of operation and maintenance that we've had to do for this has been very minimal, which is excellent. This has been supported by many people. So it's basically a collaboration, at civil engineering department at UBC. We've been helping with some of the technical consulting work and then of course doing research on it. But we had the support of many entities. So the Hupatchisat First Nations, Indigenous Services Canada, First Nations Health Authority, the Nuu Tribal Council. So it's really been a collaboration to get this running. And then I wanted to talk about a couple others. So we heard about rainwater harvesting and septic tanks that DIGDEEP works on. We also evaluate these technologies in my research lab. So this is a biosand and biochar filter combined with ultraviolet light emitting diodes for rainwater treatment. This project was actually done in Kenya because we have a postdoc in my group who's from Kenya. So we wanted to pilot it where we have a strong connection with the community, and now I'm talking with Indigenous Services Canada about how can we disseminate this in First Nations communities that may need the same types of systems. But here, we collect rainwater, and then we've got the green tank with the biosand and biochar filtration. We store that treated water in UV or in this pre-UV tank. And then we have a gravity-driven system, so turn on a tap and it runs through the ultraviolet light-emitting diode system, which turns on once water's running through it. And we've seen a great disinfection efficacy with this. So any bacteria that might make it through the biosand filter, they're going to get zapped by the UV light. So this has been great, and we've been comparing with and without the biochar layer as well. We do a lot of ultraviolet LED reactor validation and testing in my lab. So again, we're testing the solutions in the lab to model them and predict how they may work in the field, and then piloting them in the field, and then disseminating from there. And here we're looking at applications of ultraviolet LEDs for drinking water treatment, but also for wastewater treatment. And I'm even looking into them for stormwater treatment in combination with peracetic acid. So protecting public health, but also protecting the environment. So we're looking at lots of different solutions, but just what are the next levels of applications of these technologies. And then this one, so you mentioned septic tanks. So this is ultraviolet LEDs for treating either secondary wastewater or for treating septic tank effluent. And this was at lab scale, so we haven't piloted this one in the community yet, but you'll see a theme where with multi-barrier treatment technologies, we're combining like a filtration step. We've looked at many different types of filters. This one is a woven fiber textile. We've also looked at sand filtration, and we've also looked at cartridge filters, and we've also looked at hollow fiber. But this one is in combination with UV. The other project I mentioned was in combination with chlorination. So we're looking at different combinations of having the physical barrier and then having either the chemical or photochemical barrier. So this one, is published in an article in Water. We have a review paper coming out with other applications of woven textile microfiltration. So basically, how can you take a textile and use that for water treatment or for pre-treatment processes? And then I wanted to mention that we put together a document of case studies of where ultraviolet light has been used in different applications around the world, and then what can we learn from it so that we can provide that information to practitioners who are interested in using UV light. There's a preprint of the case study document available online, and then we're trying to get it published. But you can, in the meantime, go to this map, iuva.org. We have a task force dedicated to using UV to address the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And you can go to this map and then click on any of these pins and learn more about the system and learn more about what technologies were installed and what challenges they might have encountered and what solutions are in place to address the challenges. So, and this is for different projects around the world. So there's one at a First Nation in Canada, also Jamestown, Colorado, had a system. There was a randomized controlled trial of UV in Mexico City. And then also the EPA developed a WOW cart, they call it, for treatment in emergency scenarios. So you can learn more about that there. And then finally, I just wanted to do a shameless plug for my lab, the Beck Lab at UBC, and also for WASH Canada. So you can check out our website and learn more about our research there, what technologies we're involved in. And then if you go to WASH Canada, this is a consortium of academics in Canada that are doing work in WASH, either in Canada or abroad, but you can learn more. We've also got a YouTube channel, and we've got a weekly speaker series, so you can log in there to learn more about what people are working on. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Beck. So many interesting things happening with new technologies. Next up is Troy Cly, the project manager of the DILCON project within the Navajo Water Project of DIGDEEP. And he's going to share with you a little bit of the technology that is used there.
Well, thank you, Kimberly. Good morning. Thank you for allowing me to be here presenting to you all on behalf of DIGDEEP. So who is DIGDEEP? We were founded in 2011 by George McGraw. We are a nonprofit organization with the focus of WASH, water, sanitation, and hygiene. We have three current project hubs, AWP Appalachia, CWP Colonias in Texas, AWP West Virginia, and of course the Navajo Water Project, which spans across 3 states, Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. We are a community-led project that bring clean, hot, and cold running water plumbing into individual homes on the Navajo Reservation. So DIGDEEP, of course, like I mentioned, 3 main branches. throughout the U.S., Appalachia, West Virginia, Texas, Navajo Nation, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado, or Utah, sorry. We have 3 locations within our Navajo Water Project. There is the Rue, New Mexico team, our Navajo Mountain team, which is Navajo Mountain, Utah. That borders also the Arizona state line. And then my project site, of course, in Delcon, Arizona. Those are our 3 locations. So our work is a home water system, HWS in short. Basically includes 1,200 gallon cistern tanks that are excavated into the ground. And we have that plumbed into what we have here is our on-grid system, goes into our utility sink, which houses most of the mechanics and parts that help run the water into family homes. It's also connected to a water pump that feeds into a pressure tank, water filtration, solar control module to help power the system, and then it also feeds into our tankless liquid propane water heater that brings the hot water. We also have it tied into a 4-foot by 20-foot gray water leach line that is also excavated on the outside. A lot of additional water services that we offer are septic tank installations. As you see in the picture there on the right, team is installing a 1,200 gallon cistern septic tank, on-site sewer. We also do septic cleanings for residents on the Navajo Nation. We do bathroom upgrades and additions. We also have outhouse construction for families that live further in the rural areas of the Navajo Nation. Today, by the numbers, we've to date 2024 total water deliveries is 1,109,684 gallons to among our 3 sites for our Navajo Water Project. So,
Anything else you want to?
Other than that, we're a utility alternative, of course, just bringing hot and cold water into family homes. Everything starts from our techs going out. I'll give you a little bit further in depth. Starts with the techs going out, serving in certain communities that we have partnerships with. And, they get home assessments and see what the family needs, whether it be, we do have an on-grid system for people that are on local utilities, but then we also have the on-grid system. Then from there, we just assess the home, see what danger, safety hazards are in place, and then we just go from there and help build out our systems for the homeowners. So, and then our water delivery, we do have 3 watering stations. We have local border towns that have watering points through rigorous water testing with our engineer as well. We also do trainings to help our water truck hauler drivers better clean potable water sources to homes. We have Winslow, Arizona that houses a watering station, Holbrook, and Flagstaff as well. Other than that, that's pretty much.
Amazing.
It. Thank you.
Thank you, Troy. Chris is going to come up and talk a little bit about the work that Water for People is doing within the U.S. and how it relates to their work globally.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Kim. I appreciate it. Thanks, Kabir, for inviting me to be here. I'm Chris Fryman. I'm the U.S. Program Manager for Water for People. I'm excited to be here to share with you all today. I was asked to speak a little bit about some of the lessons and approaches that we are taking from all of our wonderful international work and translating to be here in our first high-income context country program in the United States. And so, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of tech that I'm going to show you. It's more about the approach and more about the style of work that we're bringing and trying to translate to fit into a different context. So for those of you that are not familiar with Water for People, we are a global wash organization that currently works in 9 countries outside of the United States. There's about 250 of us, and we are working in close to 40 districts throughout this global context. 4 countries in Africa, 4 in Latin America, and India. And most of this work is done in rural and peri-urban settings, and so we are very familiar with these more decentralized solutions and the need for innovative technologies to have sustainable service. And I'm gonna kind of take some lessons that are from all the wonderful people that are working on the ground in these contexts and for decades and decades and years, and try to think through how we can apply those as we start a new program here in the US. So for a long time in the international wash space, water points were entirely or almost entirely decentralized, right? You have boreholes and pumps and pipes and gravity-fed systems and solar systems and all these kind of decentralized systems. And they're all can be really great. They can all be very important and help communities, but they all have operations and maintenance issues. They all have different things that need to be thought through in the system, which Kim mentioned at the very beginning, kind of the system and the enabling environment that is required for them to be sustainable over time. We've all heard stories of, or participated in, or seen in our own work, where you put in a system and you return a few years later and it's not functioning, there are parts missing, it's broken, the person who is maintaining it or knows how to run it is no longer in town, all these different things that come into place, and the system is no longer sustainable for the long term for the community to have service. And so it's really important for us in Water for People, and something that we've learned over time experiencing those issues, to think through that entire system, to think through the enabling environment, so that we can have systems that look a little bit more like the photo on the right than the photo on the left over time. So many organizations in the international sphere, including ourselves, use the WASH building blocks, and we think through a lot of these various pieces of a system. And of course, the technology is incredibly important. All of the wonderful things that my 2 colleagues up here were showing are super important, and we need innovative solutions for these areas that are incredibly difficult to be connected. And it's just one piece of the puzzle, though, right? And so in order for that to happen, even if we're just thinking about the tech and the infrastructure, you need to have an operations and management plan from the beginning. I know the second half of this talk, some others are going to speak about these various building blocks, but you need that O&M plan. You need to have a system of spare parts nearby, so if something breaks, you can have it fixed within a reasonable time frame and for a reasonable cost. You have to have a workforce that knows how to manage it, knows how to maintain it, and hopefully gets paid a decent wage to do so, right? And so that's just the infrastructure part. And as the EPA administrator spoke about this morning, sometimes we have the solutions, but the politics get in the way, right? And so we got to think through the regulatory and accounting system. We got to think through all these other pieces. Sometimes it's funding or co-finance, or that there is funding available, but there's all these different challenges for communities to be able to access them, right? And so how can we reduce those barriers and think through all these different parts in order to have a sustainable service for whatever community we're working with? So globally in our work, we're using this approach to think through the entire system at the local level, at the national level, at various scales. And we're taking that to think through, okay, this is the kind of thing that we can translate here into the US. And so now I'll speak a little bit about that. So we have many partners that are doing amazing on the ground work that are already in this context, such as DIGDEEP, such as our partners over here, right, that are installing systems that have this kind of thing. And so we were thinking, as we start a US program, as we start to work in a high-income context, where can we best complement those that are already in this space? Where can we support and fill in? And it's really what Water for People brings to the table is this systems approach, thinking through all these various pieces of the system in order for it to be sustainable. And so we're trying to do that at various scales here within our work, starting with the national scale. You see here are many of our partners in the Vessel Collective, which is a national coalition that we co-founded with DIGDEEP. And all of these partners are doing amazing work and coming together to think through at the national level, how can we think through all those different building blocks? How can we strengthen the system in that scale, and then support areas that are more acutely feeling the impacts of the access gap. And so we've been at it for about a year now in our US program. And so far we've been able to work at a couple of scales. So I just mentioned the national. It's been mostly that kind of vessel work, bringing people together, convening, thinking through where are the gaps, how can we fill them, all those kinds of things. What technology is needed, what data is needed, all that. How can we advocate, how can we speak with a collective voice? And then we're also starting to work in more localized and regional settings. And that has mostly been so far in the first year in Arizona, in the colonias. But it's really the same type of strengthening work, but with partners, networks, coalitions that are already in place, already working on this issue, have trust, have communities, are really working in this space, and just trying to come in and see where we can add value, where we can add support, and connect them to solutions, whether that's technologies such as this, or whether that's another partner, or connecting to a funding mechanism, or whatever it is. And so that's really the start of our US program. Very, very high level and quick. I sprinted through that. So if you have questions, happy to answer them as we go. Thank you.
As the one with the mic, I'm going to take advantage of it and kick us off with a couple of questions, and then we will have a microphone going around the audience, so I'd love to get some audience questions as well. Troy, I'm going to start with you, and I'm curious if there are particular challenges. We had a long conversation at dinner last night about one of the challenges, but are there particular challenges with the home water system? And what is the kind of long-term vision for the context of this vast piece of land what do you envision that looking like? So what are the challenges you see with the technology, and then how do you see it playing out over the long term?
Yeah, thank you, Kimberly. One of the challenges that we deal with on our home water system is dealing with manufactured parts. Eventually over time with wear and tear, as you maintain something, they're eventually bound to go out. So that leads into your second question of how the team deals with the issue, and that's through once the installation is complete, our techs do offer on-site training with the homeowners of how to help maintain, how to care for the do's and don'ts of the parts that are in it, the components that tie everything together. We do on-site training with the homeowners and make sure they understand before we leave their home site. But we also do offer continuous maintenance. Say the elderly woman we installed for doesn't quite understand how it works, we will go back and help her maintain the system, or any other homeowner that may have certain issues with certain parts. The long-term ideal for Navajo Nation is, I think I want to say, well, we are kind of it, only because, like you mentioned, our watering point to my office is 45 to 50 miles, but from my office spread across 5 communities, it's, the unmaintained or rarely maintained dirt roads that we have to drive to get to these homes is, it's kind of the reason why we don't have a lot of main permanent fixtures for water solutions up there.
That's great. There's one additional challenge that we run into that has nothing to do with the technology, and that is something called a home site lease, and it's similar to a title or a deed to land. And it's not proving ownership, but it's a piece of paper that you have to make any improvements or changes to the household. And getting that piece of paper takes so much time, so much patience, so many hoops to jump through. And there are days that I wake up and I think this is the silliest problem that we're having. We're getting in our own way of solving this problem. People need to have access to drinking water. And here we are spending precious time and energy helping households jump through these hoops to get this piece of paper. And we talked at length recently about the office is open 2 days a week, not always the same 2 days a week. Right, I mean, so there's challenges like that that get in the way of the best technology, the best design technology. So thinking about it holistically, I'm so grateful to have partners like Troy, who really know the context on the ground, and that partnership is critical to addressing this. Just to give you a scope of the size of the Navajo Nation, we were talking this morning, Patrick, about it's 27,000 square miles. For those of you who think in kilometers, that's about 70,000 square kilometers. If you think about a map, it's about the size of the Netherlands. 1.5 times the size of the Netherlands. So hopefully that will contextualize it for everyone in the room, regardless of where you're coming from. Dr. Beck, similar question to you. What are the challenges that you run into, that you face in the First Nations context?
Yeah, great question. And a lot of it, when I think about a lot of this, like you said, there's so many other factors involved. It's not just the technology. And I know this before I was in academia. I was actually with Engineers Without Borders, and so I encountered a lot of the problems with operation and maintenance, and engaging all the stakeholders and capacity building and all of these things. And so I'm sort of hesitant to get involved. That's actually why I switched into research, as I felt more comfortable kind of advancing technology, but I kind of want to be involved in both. But some of the issues that we've encountered with the gravity-driven membrane system, it actually has been working incredibly well. I mean, the challenge was more forming all the partnerships to get it started and getting the funding, getting everything lined up. But now that it's in place, it's been working really well. We've had a couple of interruptions. One was just a power outage for 5 days, so that wasn't so bad. Another one was there's a compressor that's needed for the vacuum pumps, and somebody had accidentally turned it off. And so we didn't realize that until someone went to do their weekly checkup. And so that was something that we encountered. But otherwise, we haven't had to replace those ultrafiltration modules very often. In fact, we've been replacing them for research, not out of need for performance. So that system has been working incredibly well. With UV, there are other challenges. Supply chain, you mentioned, getting it out there. Companies, they're still new. We're still learning, like if a system is on continuously, it may burn out, things like that. And then, of course, replacing the lamps, fouling and scaling issues, which I can talk about later.
Yeah, sometimes the human interaction is where the technology breaks down, because we mess things up. Yeah, flipping off a switch when we don't need to. Yeah, Chris, so obviously in the context where Water for People has worked before moving into the US, what are some of the learnings from small systems, off-grid systems? I think people in this room are probably very familiar with many of those systems. What are the learnings from the places where Water for People works that you're bringing or you see as potentially replicable to be adapted into the US context?
Yeah, great, thank you. So I think that, as I spoke about earlier, thinking through the various pieces of that system can be just like a great start in thinking about having a sustainable system for a community. As Dr. Beck just mentioned, sometimes it's the access to that technology that can be really hard with the UV system, but in the international space, for a long time, people didn't want to implement solar systems because it was really logistically and financially difficult to be able to replace pieces and things as they broke down. And now there's so many solar pumps and everything all over, right? And so as time grows, that will hopefully increase. I think the other thing is that whatever technology is chosen, it needs to really be tailored to the situation in that community. And so you're not here in the United States gonna put in a super intense wastewater system in a place that doesn't have the capacity or the funding to have an operator or any of those kinds of things, or a rainwater system where you're not gonna catch much rain, or those kinds of things. So it has to be really tailored. And then something we've spoken a lot about the last couple of days is the impacts of climate change and becoming more resilient to those things. And I think that that is something that's being faced in all of our international work, as well as will be and continues to be incredibly prevalent here in the United States. And so we need whatever technology it is to think through kind of the ability to be resilient to those shocks and stressors and have more climate resilient wash systems here in the US, and to think through what is going to be the climate in the space in the future as we implement those technologies. And so not just, the storm that's coming, but, what's going to be the more kind of common normal as we go forward. And so we have technologies that are in place for those kinds of.
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to open it to the floor. Who has questions and who wants to get us started with those questions? Thanks, Claire. Claire's our microphone runner this morning.
Hi, thanks. I'm Stephen Gasteyer, Michigan State University. Given the 3 answers to the last questions, which in some ways all got back to that problem of human capacity, I actually want to pick up on a caveat point by Chris, which was this having people who can do even if it's periodic, the maintenance on these systems, hopefully at a living wage. And it strikes me that that's a real barrier at this point, right? That, I did a study on small community water system operators about a decade ago and found out that they were making on average $10,000 a year, right? That's not a living wage in the United States right now. So any ideas about how we grapple with that, especially for these decentralized, marginalized community environments?
That's a great question. Does someone want to jump in first?
Everybody's looking at me. How do we grapple with that? I think that I think it has to be really built in from the beginning when you're planning a system, right? Is that not only will we have funding to build the system, but funding to supply for the training that the people go through to maintain it and for them to have a wage. And that's really tricky in our funding mechanisms here in the United States. And many systems are volunteer run or $10,000 a year, or and I don't have a good answer on how to change that, other than that we all need to recognize that that's a major issue and be able to speak about it together, and say, hey, this is something that our sector faces as a big challenge, and that we can all discuss with whether it's regulators or whether it's state grant officials or whoever is able to potentially fill in some of those funding gaps and speak collectively about it. And if enough people draw attention to that issue, hopefully there's some kind of change.
There's a term out there called the silver tsunami, and there's some ridiculously high percentage, I want to say it's 40% or more, of the workforce in water and sanitation in the US will be retiring in the next decade. That's a huge gap and will leave a huge gap. I have met people on the ground that DIGDEEP works with at local utilities who are ready. They want to retire. They want to be done. They want to rest. And there's no one to hand it over to, right? A wastewater treatment operator, a water treatment operator, someone who manages a local utility. By the way, there's 55,000 utilities across the US. There's 150,000 systems in the US that are managed by those 55,000 utilities. 2/3 of those addressing systems that serve less than 1,000 or so people. So it's a wild context. We are doing some work. I know our friends at IAPMO are doing some work on workforce development, but it's a great question. It's a huge part of the equation overall. So thank you for that question. I saw a hand in the back, and then I see Patrick's hand as well. AK.
Good morning, Marcia Glenn, USAID. I see a lot of the similar situations that we face in the international setting that I've heard here today. But the question is, I think for Troy and to a greater extent to Sarah and Chris, what on average is the cost per household for some of the household systems being installed?
Yes, thank you for that question. For us, typical home water system, I think we are averaging around 5,000 for parts, and then of course the labor that goes into it, the trucking of equipment, fuel prices, everything like that. So I want to say we're right about maybe 10,000 per install.
Is that water or wastewater?
Both.
Oh, yeah.
That's a great question. For the gravity-driven membrane system that I mentioned, it's interesting because the capital costs for that were about 35,000. It's Canadian, so say it's roughly 30,000 US, and it's only serving 10 households. But we had to meet regulations, right? So we had to add the chlorine step. So then you have to look at safety for having a chlorine. So it actually ended up being 250,000 when you look at like, okay, you have chlorine, so then you need a shower. So if you have a shower, you need a hot water heater, so then you have power. So it scaled up. Like if you have it at its smallest scale, it would be, 4,000 a house. The other system with the UV LEDs, you could also do that for 4,000 a house or less. But it scales up to meet certain requirements.
Many of these households are last mile, right? They're the hardest to reach, and so they are going to be the most expensive to reach, which is not uncommon around the world as well.
And that's, again, the capital cost, so that's not even looking into additional operational costs. One of the challenges with this is you're transferring the burden of the water to the households. That's
Great. Let's go to Patrick and then Watts.
Thank you. So, fantastic. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's really interesting. My name is Patrick Moriarty. I'm with IRC WASH, also the One for All Alliance, and also a member of Sanitation Water for All, which is a global partnership championing human right to access to that public service that we all believe in, that is safe water and sanitation. Within SWA, we put a lot of emphasis on accountability. Who's accountable for ensuring that people have access to that human right? And we focus on trying to lift WASH up the political agenda. I think that's what you guys are doing. We try and get heads of state to take an interest and sign up to it. But and I guess this is probably for a lot of us who aren't from the US or Canada. My question: who's accountable for? Who's actually responsible to ensure that people in the US or in Canada have access to that human right? Or is anyone accountable? Because what I'm hearing from you guys is fascinating, but it sounds amazingly like the kind of charity-driven models that we see in many poorer countries. And it feels extraordinary that in these incredibly wealthy countries, you're talking about things like the high cost of last mile, and that's been met by charity as far as I can see. And a little anecdote to finish that off: I had a French colleague who came from a part of rural France. Her grandparents were farmers. They lived on one of the last farms in France to be connected to the kind of formal grid. It cost 15,000 euros to connect it, but they didn't pay that because it was just accepted that that's part of dealing at a grid level system, and they had a perfectly good, well, I'm not even sure they wanted the connection, but they got it, and the state picked up that $15,000 of capex. So, because it's clear who's accountable in France, and it wasn't them.
It's a complicated answer is where I'm going to start, because it depends, right? It depends if you're on a private well, and 45 million Americans are on a private well for their water access. The EPA, the administrator this morning, his department doesn't touch that because that's at the household level. He is responsible for the 90% of people in this country and the 90% of systems that are public systems, that are defined as public systems. And when you're dealing with tribal lands, it is then sovereign nation, and who is responsible on the Navajo Nation for water access, Troy? Is that an easy question, or? It's multi-layered.
Yeah, like you said, multi-layered. This comes down to, I would say, just homeowners doing what they can, with what they have, traveling and, like I said, 45 to 50 miles into town, either getting grocery packaged water bottles or going to the local springs. So it just, reach out to your community, they'll help some, but it just comes down to homeowners is the way I would answer it.
Great. And Sarah in Canada, what? First Nations?
Yeah, it's similar. So the burden fell to the First Nations communities, but then that's been an issue. And since I think it was 2016 where the government pledged to give $4.6 billion or $4.7 billion roughly to help improve the water. But then there's a bottleneck with like getting all the players involved and getting Indigenous Services Canada to match the treatment with the community and getting all the support that you need and the operators and the testing the water. So yeah, but it's complicated, just like in the US.
There's no one Ministry of Water to go to in the US to answer that question. Kabir, do you want to add anything in terms of?
Not on the panel.
Well, I know, but Kabir is a colleague who works on policy at the US level and understands the government and the functioning of it much better than I do.
There are, I think, two core elements to this complicated piece. And thank you, Dr. Moriarty, for the question. And thank you for Kim for bringing audience participation to a new level. There are two elements here that I think are pretty key. The US and several other high-income nations around the world have not declared a human right to water and sanitation within their borders. In the US political context, that is very unlikely to even happen. There are many folks who will not go near the words human rights as a concept generally. But more importantly, the declaration of the human right isn't the space maybe necessarily needed to allow for more folks to be part of this. The sectors within each high-income nation, like the international sector, are truly accountable have some responsibility to hold the governments accountable within the high-income nations to ensure that these last 2 million folks in the US, or however many million across other high-income nations around the world, should be taking responsibility at the end of the day. And while that goal in the long term should be government ownership, in the meantime, we have an incredible set of coalition organizations from the private sector to academia to nonprofits who can and are coming together and will bear that responsibility as well. But ultimately, it should be on the government. In the context of the US, over 100 years ago, there was a nationwide push to provide at this point, 98% of systems around the United States to provide water access for people, sanitation access. Why should those last 2% be left behind? And we as organizations in the US context, in the Canadian context, in Australia, every other high-income nation need to be shouting that from the rooftops, be going to our legislative bodies, be going to form coalitions and networks to ensure that that is codified and gives teeth to the organizations and the communities, most importantly, that are stuck within these gaps.
Great. Thanks, Kabir. We have a few questions right here where Claire is standing. So do you want to ask that, and then we'll jump back to AK.
If I could contribute to this
Yes,
part of the
please.
conversation,
Great,
I'm
thank you.
from Canada, and I feel this really personally, having grown up both in urban and rural, and having a mother who directed the rural physicians, or was in northern Saskatchewan, have been up across the Arctic, have seen incredible local ownership and management of water by First Nations communities, and also some of what you've heard already here. And yes, there's the accountability piece, but there's also a lens in which we grow up in, creates how we look at the challenge. Canada, US, Australia have massive rural populations, have huge spaces, even when rural just outside of Toronto is very different than rural Cambridge Bay north of the Arctic. And so the challenge to be able to address that from if you've only grown up in a city and you've only looked at the challenge from within a European context, doesn't translate. And so when we're talking about solving this globally, I think there's a huge opportunity to be looking at governance models that have happened within places like Australia, like Canada, that have worked and haven't worked. And also then being able to look at the sort of learning north-south, because it doesn't, I think it's everything that's been said so far in terms of the accountability and the challenges and the complexity of it. it's big, right? And reaching rural populations and anyways, I've already said it.
That's great.
So I have a technical question. So Troy, how long does the 1,200-gallon cistern last? And then what's it look like? What's the process of refilling that look like? And then the same question with the gravity-fed membrane. How many households can it serve? How much are they using per day? What's the capacity, for those prices?
Yes, great question. So 1,200 gallon that we install in homes, I'd say it just kind of varies on number of households. And then their ultimate usage, how they're using it and stuff like that. But we go to homes that we offer to answer the second question first, we offer a 30-day refill free of charge to the homeowner. And then from there, that's kind of where we, so-and-so down the road, we fill them up and we only put 150 gallons and then you go back another month and, it's 150 gallons. So that's where we kind of get a lot of the numbers and who uses how much amount. And then plus we have our data system that we work with Kimberly's team that we kind of track numbers using our M-Water, stuff like that.
For the passive gravity-driven membrane filtration system that we mentioned, like I said, it's 10 households. It was designed for 40 liters per square meter per hour. Actually, it was designed for 10, but we're exceeding that. So we actually end up dumping half the water into a ditch nearby just because the supply is greater than the demand for it. So that could certainly be scaled up to at least double, but probably more than that. And we've seen the flux kind of decrease little by little over time, but we're still hitting the target.
Who's behind you? Oh, sorry.
Cool.
We're going to wrap up in 2 minutes, so let's take 2 more quick questions.
Awesome. And Troy, you just mentioned what I was going to ask about. So I'm Eric from ACVO. Nice to meet you guys. Thank you. The data system that you just mentioned. If you could please talk about the systems that you guys are using to collect and analyze and use this data for decision making, and the gaps that you see in data, and what could be done to improve to address the data gaps.
Can I put a pin on your question? Because we're going to get to data in the next section of some of the challenges and the gaps in the overall how we do that, because we are going to talk about that specifically on the next panel, and I want to give people a minute if they're going to jump to another room or invite you to get a cup of coffee before you stay here. Let's go to one final question over here.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Armugam Kalimadhu from one of the leading NGO from India, WAS Institute. It's not a question, just for would like to share an information. We are looking for a localized, decentralized solution for septic tank emptying. So we have come up with a mobile septic treatment unit. Mobile septic treatment on the spot, it sucks everything from the septic tank, separate solid and liquid get treated on the spot. It's recognized by the Government of India. Now Government of India is funding for the state government to buy these trucks across the country. There's a lot of demand now going, more than 200 plus trucks going to be the state government going to buy. So if in case you are looking for septic tank emptying decentralized way, maybe you can think about that. We are an NGO, we are not a commercial organization. We are happy to share the details. And yeah, it's a 6,000 liters per hour. That's the capacity of the mobile septic treatment unit. So yeah, that's just a suggestion. Thanks.
Great, we will connect and talk about that after line. Thank you, AK. Okay, we're going to take one more question, or you. As Claire walks over.
My question was, what do the communities? Hi, I'm Lisa from Nazafa Water Filters. Do the communities pay for their water? Is there like some kind of ownership? And maybe you can combine the answers.
Can I add mine?
Please.
Okay, so I think somebody asked about the sustainability issue, which we are already having a big issue in the developing world. Now that this is a beginning system, we have to tackle it and address it so that we don't run into the same problems. To what extent are the reservations leadership involved in all these activities that we do? That's the first question. And then the second question is, as we are beginning to do these decentralized systems, there's no way we are going to have cost recovery enough to keep these. Are we planning on having, maybe revisiting some of the circuit rider programs that existed in the US several years ago? Thank you.
Great question. Who wants to jump in first? Questions?
Yes,
from
my side.
Question number one, as far as with us here at DIGDEEP, no, the homeowners don't pay for anything. We do everything free of charge, from the installation all the way to the monthly water hauling that we do. Thank you.
I don't know the answer to that question for the system that I mentioned, so I don't know what the homeowners are paying.
And I would jump in and add that the learning from what's been done in the global wash sector to high-income country settings is, the learning opportunities are incredible. So I invite everyone in this room and everyone listening online to join us in the dialogue, because there's a lot of, I don't know how you want to call it, low and middle income country learning to high-income country learning, south to north, label it however you would like, but there are a lot of things, I think your question points to it, that have already been sorted out and figured out in multiple contexts, and taking that learning and not having to start from scratch is absolutely at the top of my learning agenda in terms of how not to recreate the wheel. There are conversations about circuit rider programs happening. I've heard a few things at this conference about them happening right here in the US. So yes is the answer, the short answer, but it's not a wide program, and there's a lot of room to expand on that. So thank you all for being here. A quick preview of some of the topics we're going to talk. I'm pulling up my notes so I don't forget any of them. Implementation and technological limitations, data needs, law and policy, funding barriers, equity concerns, sustainability. So many of those last questions were easing us into the second half of this 2-hour block. And so we will break for a minute or two, and then we'll reconvene and dive into that a little bit deeper. Thanks so much.
And I hope I didn't sound like I was doing the charity. Not at all. I'm more like I was just saying. Responsible criticism.
We had a chance to.
Busy.
That's right.
I'd love to talk to you more about it. My session, actually.
I appreciate your input.
Exactly.
Just amazing how well that's
It's hard to. I should have been.
This partnership with DIGDEEP to try and exactly synergize the 2 years of improvement together.
We started in Southern Arizona so that we could Colonia's project time to also come out as well and to be able to to say, hey, all of these people are under your jurisdiction and they are not served. And so we intentionally spread ourselves out a little bit so they weren't overlapping, so we could speak collectively at that state level. So I'm really excited for partnerships and really bring voice to the government office.
It's me on 10 with our cap.
What we learned from our international work, so that's, oh my goodness.
ability to work. You do last one?
I'm based in DC. We're on High Street, not too far off.
I would have loved to hear
Yeah, they're bouncing together on vessel and
Our CEO, she has a house in Las Vegas. She comes to DC sometimes, but she's back in Las Vegas.
currently talking with them within, it's not a place for one volunteers, or we're not yet set up for that. And so I really
Very hard to start
doing,
doing.
and in charge, and share all of the that's a really
policy and external relations, so our government affairs policy work.
I think it's going well. You know, the last year we're trying to get it under control.
I'm sure
Last year, finally,
when you step up
I will certainly share that, and we're just and wanting to be particularly in that space.
make sure that the food's understanding.
Yeah, and I think that seems to be a really important aspect that we need to as well, and partnerships as
It's really nice to meet them.
right, like we really
Was one of our research team members out there, was Laura there?
and it's actually
But it's so it's
Renner, yeah, it's her, she's the mayor of it, and I just, who was actually in DC.
I will tell you after this.
Hi everybody, we're beginning the second session very shortly. I love all the conversations happening. If you don't mind saving them for noon and finding a seat shortly, we're going to get started here in another minute.
Next time you see them, I'd love to connect with them too. You venturing out?
That's it.
Great to see you.
I mean, I see there's a point.
I got 3 slides left.
5 minutes, 7 minutes is a sprint. How you doing?
That's it's kind of wonderful beside the walls. So the estimation was between survivability and there's a point of mitigation, and most of them are only.
And in our own way, this is what I say all the time, we're like tripping over
I think it might that water because they've been doing so now they're gonna switch for this.
Getting started another second here. For those online, thank you for your patience.
Yes, I will follow up with you.
Question, you know, this is a question, working around.
So it's this one, but we'll let you go back.
Glad you're working with me.
I'll be in touch.
Yes, he's an art camper.
I'm sorry.
They're on.
Well, my bag is there. That's my table. That's fine.
Good to have on around.
I'll stop carrying around.
It's good to see you. How's your dissertation? It's almost done. You're in DC?
Right now.
Right.
Answer any questions. Yep.
My shit is falling out.
Stay in touch.
Good morning, everybody. What a wonderful first panel and what an incredible day. Huge thank you to UNC for integrating high-income country day to their already really busy, already really incredible schedule. And we're extra thankful to our panelists from the first session for walking us through some incredible technology use around different high-income contexts, especially the US and Canada, in terms of decentralized systems. We approached the first session in more of a technical way, a little bit more focused on different types of technologies, implementation, challenges that kind of arise around it. This session is going to move a little bit more into applicability. And we're going to be tackling a few challenges. You'll hear from each of our panelists today on the various challenges around implementation, around policy and funding, around data, and a few other things as well. And I should say, my name is Kabir Thate. I am Vice President for Policy and External Relations at DIGDEEP, a human rights organization here in the US working to close the water access gap for the 2 million people that are living without water and sanitation here in the US. I wanted to provide a little bit of additional context just quickly up top. In the US, like I just mentioned, over 2 million people don't have running water or working toilet at home. In Canada, people living on First Nations reserves are 90 times more likely to lack running water than other Canadians. In the US, it's 19 times more likely than white Americans. In Australia, tap water in more than 500 remote Indigenous communities isn't regularly tested and often isn't safe to drink. In the EU, 1 in 3 Roma people live in housing without safe drinking water. And in the UK, it's estimated about 20% of people cannot afford their water bill. So, as you can see, there is maybe been a myth perpetuated for a while that high-income nations don't have any issues when it comes to the final mile of folks that don't have running water or sanitation in their nations, but that is not true. And I am very lucky to be joined by an esteemed panel here today to discuss some of the ongoing challenges in applying different types of technology, different types of solutions to a lot of these communities. A lot of these communities are rural, but you'll also hear from some of our panelists that this isn't entirely a rural issue. This is also peri-urban. This is urban in the context of particularly unhoused communities. And this is a very universal, ongoing issue that we as a sector internationally and domestically need to come together to solve. So I'm gonna kick off super quickly with a little audience participation. Who here works purely in a high-income nation context as an organization? Okay, just a couple. That says a lot, right? We have a very huge international focus, critically important given that there are 2 billion folks internationally that don't have running water. But one of the core components that we'll cover a bit today is going to be that we don't really know the scale or the scope of the issue of how many people don't have running water or sanitation in high-income contexts, because they're largely invisible, they're left behind, they're forgotten, and it's up to us as a sector to change that. And without further ado, we're going to go through all of these challenges one by one. And instead of all of you hearing me yap through each challenge, we're going to go through with each of our panelists to talk through the various challenges that are up here. And to quickly recap, we have equity concerns, policy funding and law barriers, data needs, implementation and technological barriers, and sustainability and O&M. And I'm going to start with Grace to introduce yourself and talk through equity concerns.
Great. So, my name is Grace Perry. I'm a final year PhD student at Leeds University, otherwise CDT. So my main focus is on unhoused communities in the UK. Currently, I think I'm just assuming everyone is aware because it's in the media a lot. The UK is faced with public toilets, decline, closures, and basically if you are in the city centers and public spaces and parks, there's nowhere to go. So the government, local authorities, the public, the academics, there's been a few papers, all agree that we've got the public toilet problem. And voices have been rising in the last 2 decades. but the voices of marginalized communities like unhoused rough sleepers who spend most of their time in the city center is still missing. So faced with this problem, where the government and local authorities have sort of shifted the responsibility of public toilet provision to private businesses in what we are now calling in the UK, I don't know if anywhere else, publicly available toilets. So people have been saying they're not working because you go into a shop and you ask to use the toilets, the staff are saying no. So the government has offered a few solutions to that in not changing anything in particular, but in trying to convince the public that what website will work and it's gonna work. You've got to accept it because there is no policy which says they should start providing public toilets again. So one solution which has been offered by the UK government is what are called community public toilet schemes, which the private businesses have offered a grant, a cleaning grant. I don't know how much. No one really knows how much. It differs from maybe local authority to local authority. For the private businesses to allow members of the public to use their toilets, and then they can put a sticker on a window to say, we are on the community public toilet scheme, so you can come in and use our toilets. But of course, the businesses just take the money and then they don't put stickers on the window, and then you don't know who is on the scheme and who is not, and therefore the confusion still remains. The second solution was, okay, we'll create this Great British Public Toilet Map, so you know where toilets are, which can be accessed by members of the public. But then, of course, we're still talking about the same businesses who have not been consulted and who probably don't even know they are on this map. And the map is very poorly organized. There is no update on data, there are no opening times, and it's basically poorly run. And for unhoused rough sleepers, that's even not a solution, because the financial burden of a smartphone, of being on the internet all the time, is another barrier. So that's not a solution for unhoused rough sleepers. So, and then there is a case of the government producing more documents, leveling up documents. We are creating more green spaces. We are pedestrianizing the city centers. But without the supporting infrastructure like public toilets, who is going to sit in the green spaces for 3 hours, and then when you want to pee, you've got to run to find a bus to take you home to pee. That's not gonna work either. So at the moment in the UK, these are the solutions that have been offered, which are no solutions at all. So the problem remains and the confusion remains. Who is responsible?
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. Yeah, it comes in all forms, and unhoused communities remain not part of the conversation in a lot of contexts, right? And there are incredible folks who are looking into solutions around the world like Grace. So if you are not considering unhoused communities, indigenous communities, any community that you may not be considering as part of the gap, I encourage you to look into how these nuances really work and how different communities are impacted by different ongoing issues. Thank you so much, Grace. Appreciate you. And Ted, I'm going to move on to you to talk through policy funding and law barriers.
Yeah, well, thank you. Is this on?
Yes.
Thank you, Kabir. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this conference. I've never been to UNC's campus, so thank you. My name is Ted Steiger. I'm our Chief External Affairs and Policy Officer for the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, RCAP. We do have a former RCAP alum in the audience here, Dr. Gasteyer, actually. But we are a national nonprofit serving small and rural communities just in the United States. All 50 states are U.S. territories and tribal nations. We've been around for over 50 years. We are funded by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, USDA Rural Development, a whole host of other agencies to be able to provide technical assistance and training to small and rural communities. I'm a recovering Capitol Hill staffer, I still am, so I've been working on policy issues facing small and rural for a number of years. And federal funding and federal policy, Safe Drinking Water Act, Clean Water Act, it's pretty clear that if you're a customer served by a utility, utilities are regulated under those laws. If you're somebody that's on a well, septic, you're not on a utility, you're kind of on your own. It's a hodgepodge of state, local regulations that's kind of pieced it together. So we started working with DIGDEEP and others. RCAP used to do a report, thanks to Dr. Gasteyer, that analyzed a census question that asked the question about having indoor plumbing. Do you have a toilet? Do you have a septic system that works? And that was a question that was on the long form of on the census, but Congress took that question away. And so we've been trying to hodgepodge data from the American Community Survey, the American Housing Survey, but we have been successful in trying to create several new federal programs that address the decentralized issue. What about homeowners that are needing help? They're having a failing septic system. Their private well is gone. They don't have access. So we've been able to make a few changes to some USDA programs. We have a farm bill, even though when you say farm bill, there's so much more that the farm bill does than just farms. But we've been able to make some changes to programs that allow both for wells, septics, innovative technologies. We were also able to create a new program through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law at EPA that would allow subgrants to low-income homeowners to be able to refurbish their decentralized systems, septic systems. We haven't been able to get it funded yet. I think Kabir will be able to help us. I said, he's the guy that might know. But we continue to work on these issues, and the challenge is, one, when you go to Washington, you go to Capitol Hill, and they're like, well, what's the data? And I said, well, we can try to get you better data, but it's a hodgepodge. Right now, we estimate about 2 million, but we think that is grossly underestimated, and that's what we're working on as well. But we've been able to make some strides there because, right, the SRF program, some states do have programs designed under the Clean Water SRF that can help low-income homeowners, but again, it's very state-specific, local-specific, and we've been able to try to change federal policy a little bit more to be a little bit more flexible to folks that are not on a utility. We have to be acknowledging of that. When I've met with several offices and members of Congress and their staff, and they're like, well, I thought the federal strategy was to get everybody on a utility. Well, if that's the case, that's not reality. And so we've been really trying to make inroads both at RCAP and working with coalitions to be able to make some advances here. So we're trying to get this other program at EPA funded. We've been working with DIGDEEP and the Vessel Group to try to get better data, put that back on the census, or at least ask more questions if people would be willing to share, so we can get a better understanding of the issue and be able to create better public policy that's based in reality and sound information. So with that, I'm happy to turn.
Thank you, Ted. Yeah, pretty critical areas of gaps around complicated policy and law when it comes from even federal funds going into the states, imperfect data being collected by a federal structure, government structure, and kind of a sparse hodgepodge of funding sources that aren't universal, that aren't applicable to maybe every context, and particularly decentralized context. Thank you for outlining all that, Ted. And an incredible segue to data needs with Allison.
Thank you. So thank you, Kabir and DIGDEEP, for the invitation. Happy to be here today. My name is Alistair Cohen. I'm an assistant professor of environmental epidemiology at Virginia Tech. And so I've been asked to talk about data, which I'm excited to do. I'll just tell you briefly, our group, we do research, so applied research focused on drinking water and health outcomes in Central Appalachia. We also do work in LMIC settings, but I'm going to focus on Central Appalachia, which is actually mostly what we've been working on for the last 5 years or so. And we also look at wastewater surveillance and epidemiology, but specifically in a rural setting. And for both, there are, of course, challenges that are unique and specific to rural settings versus urban ones. On the drinking water side, because this is also relevant to the data challenges, so we do both field-based and desk-based research. So field-based, it's a lot of work and it's expensive and time-consuming, but we can get the data that we feel we need. So household surveys, extensive water sampling and testing, using things like saliva swabs and stool samples to look at health outcomes, as well as reported data on health outcomes. So what I was asked to speak to was just kind of big picture data challenges. So staying with the US context, I would put the data challenges into a few bins, and I'm happy to provide an overview now, and I think the idea is that we'll open it up for discussion, so we can delve into this. So I'd say the broad bins would just, one, be understanding where, which populations have and do not have access to safe water, and staying with the JMP definition, current definition of safe water. And I think that's another question too, by what do we actually mean by safe water? And then a related bin is on water quality. So the water quality or water contaminants for source water, and then water once it's been treated, if it's been treated. And then the next bin I would put would be exposures. So which populations, which areas have exposures, are those more to microbiological contaminants, chemical contaminants. And then the last bin would be the health impacts. So what is the burden of disease associated with those exposures? And unfortunately, the data is lacking in some places and less so in others. And I think the other way to kind of bifurcate those bins would be by rural, urban, but more specifically, I think a more appropriate way to do it in the US context would be utility supplied versus not. And so briefly, just to kind of go back top to bottom with that in mind. So I'd say one, the estimate of how many people lack access to safe drinking water. From my personal opinion, I would agree 2 million is our best estimate, but likely an underestimate. And that comes mostly from the American Community Survey. And that's aggregated over 5 years. So that's nice, but not ideal. And then it was discussed earlier, the proportion or the absolute number of people on well water, and even that, the estimates vary. Anywhere from like 20 million to 40, 45 million. So I think a lot of people find that surprising that we don't actually have great data on that. I'll briefly mention for a number of projects, we are interested at a county level, which proportion of the population has access to utility water and which does not, assuming that those that don't are on wells or springs. We look a lot at households with spring water as well. And not surprisingly, there's data on the number of people that are connected to public utilities. And so you'd think if you just took the inverse of that, that you would get the number that are not. But the math doesn't work, and oftentimes you'll get proportions that are greater than 1. And that's complicated because utilities will sell water to each other. EPA just released a new spatial data set this summer, which we're excited to use to try to get better estimates of households not without utility water. So I guess to stay within that then, on the utility side, we have good data from thanks to the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so at a federal level, we know which systems had violations or not and what the violations were. Frustratingly, if you want to know more about that, if you want to look at the concentrations, the testing results and the associated concentrations, you have to go to a state level to these drinking water watch websites, many of which look like they were designed in the 1990s. And you can scrape the data and look at it that way, which we've done, and I know others have as well. But that actually, I think, is a very useful source of data. One paper I'll call out is Allaire et al. They did a really neat look at Safe Drinking Water Act violations across the country, and one of the conclusions was in the last decade or so, they saw more violations in rural areas but in particular in lower income rural areas. And what we're focused on, and others are focused on, is households, we looked at utilities too, but households that are not connected to utilities, and well water and spring water, and what is the burden of disease there. And that, I'd say, is one area where the data gaps are the largest. From research we've done, Heather Murphy's group and others have done in the US context, we pretty reliably see microbiological contamination in wells, and it is pretty reliably associated with household income, and also the age of the well and other factors. And then, so lastly, just to wrap up on the exposure side, I'll say on the utility side, even if we see Safe Drinking Water Act violations, we know a lot of households with utility water are not drinking their water, right? So something else our group looks at a lot is bottled water and increasing reliance on bottled water. And so a lot of households with utility water don't trust the supply, or for other reasons prefer bottled water or other beverages. And that's something else we're also interested in too, where if there's a lack of trust with the water source you have, whether it be utility or well, if that pushes you to bottled water or to other beverages like sweetened beverages, and there are health impacts there too. Interestingly, we're finding for households with well and spring water, one of the prime things they like is the taste. And at least in our research, they're more likely to drink it, but it's also more likely to be contaminated. So that's a challenge too. Just because you know something about the water quality, it doesn't mean you necessarily know something about the exposures, because you don't know necessarily what people are drinking. We're trying to look at that also with some bottled water sales data too. And then lastly, I'll wrap up because I'm probably gone over on time. On the health impact side, we work with Virginia Department of Health, others. Nobody we've talked to says that yes, they have their clinical surveillance data provides an accurate picture of the burden of disease associated with contaminated drinking water. And that's just, the nature of it is one, just because you're exposed doesn't mean you're exposed, doesn't mean you're infected. If you're infected, doesn't mean you're symptomatic. If you're symptomatic, doesn't mean you seek care. If you seek care, doesn't mean you're actually diagnosed. So that's just the nature of our system, and it's not specific to the US. But then in lower income rural areas, you have more people that are underinsured or uninsured, or less likely to seek care. And so we suspect the burden of disease is even higher there. So might have been much more than you wanted at this point.
Thank you, Alistair. I really appreciate it. And to broaden it back out to other higher income contexts as well, colleagues from around the world, like Dr. Beck in the previous session with Canada, Dr. Phil Duncan in Australia, many other friends and colleagues from around the world have shared similar concerns that clearly there is a lot of data being collected, a lot of good data. There's also a lot of bad data or lack of data being collected as we go into spaces like Ted mentioned, where we're still collecting various data, but we're not necessarily asking the right questions to understand whether there is going to be an impact on lowering the number of houses, for instance, that don't have clean running water or don't have running water at all. So a lot of challenges that will come to that. And in the second part of this session, we are going to go into tackling some more of the solutions, which our panelists have outlined. Some really great work happening right now. I'm going to move into implementation of technological implementations with Tate.
Hey everyone, I'm Tate Rogers. I'm the founder and principal at Triangle Environmental. We're a small business based just down the road in Durham, and we do R&D and consulting in on-site wastewater treatment technology. So we started off doing a lot more work. All of our work was international, so we supported a lot of groups with new, mainly on the sanitation side, technology development and implementation. So I was the guy that was willing to go literally get my hands dirty with poop in different countries, and so I had a lot of job security that way. So we supported a lot of Gates Foundation funded technologies and others in Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. We started to realize that there was a big need here in the US and that we had this wealth of experience in terms of technology development. And so about 5 years ago, we started doing some of our own technology development. And our goal is to stay in the R&D space and partner with commercial partners to scale. And so we started doing R&D and on-site wastewater treatment. We have a couple of products that are getting close to market that we're piloting. I would say, I'm not going to go into the technologies themselves. We talked about some of those this morning. It's an exciting time actually from a technology developer in this on-site wastewater space in the US. It's pretty evident. You're seeing more and more startups in the space. You're seeing conferences that didn't exist before. EPA, you had a water reuse summit this year. There's a lot of interest. There's a move towards green infrastructure. And there's cities like San Francisco that are kind of pushing the way with new regulations that are forcing commercial buildings above 250,000 square feet to have on-site wastewater treatment and reuse. So that's exciting. That means there are, there's competition, there's groups starting in this space because there's money to be made, and that is very exciting for the space. However, when I go to these, it's almost always talked about at the commercial scale, and there's not so many. I mean, there's some like ourselves that are trying to attack, the smaller residential scale systems, but there's a reason. The money gets harder when you're trying to compact these systems down to a residential scale. It gets harder and harder to do that, and then the money, the margins get worse and worse as you start to do that as well. So I do think it's an exciting time. We're moving in a good direction in terms of companies, for-profit companies being involved, which I think, I think there's a lot of opportunities for subsidies there, but there is a ton of challenges with implementation. And I think we're talking about you guys are focused on the water access gap. I mean, with sanitation, we talk about it like the gap is stable or shrinking, but where we're working in Virginia, for instance, there's more and more systems because of sea level rise that are failing. So it's not like we have so many failing systems and we're working against that. There's more and more failing systems, especially throughout the Southeast. So there's going to be a lot of work to be done. And then also there's a big change in mindset that's going to have to happen. Traditional septic just is not going to get it done in a lot of cases. I think over half of the 20 million septic systems in the US are failing. That number is probably low. And so there's going to need to be this whole shift in how we think about systems and operation and maintenance of those systems, even at a residential scale. But I'm optimistic. My company still exists, so that's a good sign that things are heading in a good direction, but I think it's an exciting time in terms of technology and implementation.
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to quickly chat about sustainability and O&M as well, which are critical components of all of this. In many cases, we talk through getting systems into different places and the importance, obviously, of getting folks online, getting connected, getting water access for the first time, or clean running water, in many cases for the first time. But unless we're incorporating sustainability and O&M as part of this, we're going to have the same problem in 5, 10, 50, 100 years. And we're in an age of technological marvel, right? We have the solutions right in front of us. And as EPA Administrator Regan said, the solutions are all here. And we're all brilliant in this room, everybody online. I know you're all brilliant. So one of the challenges as part of this is that funding, data, a lot of these components are not taken into accountability over time, how important O&M is going to be to ensuring that people don't fall back into these gaps ultimately. And in the case of federal funding, as Ted could probably attest, it is about getting that initial installation in many cases. It is about getting that first step done, but then the consideration isn't beyond that point. And that challenge is going to be really important to get into the hearts and minds of especially policymakers and those that can actually ensure that there is dedicated funding over time. I'll say one more piece on it is things like historic investments like the bipartisan infrastructure law, while really incredible and transformational and important, we need to get away from the rhetoric of work around water being transformational, being historic, being new, because it should just be an investment every single year by our governments to ensure that 2 million more people don't fall into the water access gap here in the US, to ensure that First Nations people in Canada are not 90 times more likely to lack running water. And the path to equity is to also ensure that these systems can last forever, which is not as much part of the public dialogue, or at least the funding streams as we see them, especially when it comes to, in the US here, we have SRFs, state revolving funds, which is federal money put into states, and then essentially communities that are already the most impoverished, the most disadvantaged, have to compete against one another to try to get this funding. And a lot of that funding doesn't fund O&M, doesn't consider operations and maintenance as part of the long haul. So we're going to be moving more into a discussion with our panel here, really focusing on a couple of key issues. Data, from what I'm hearing from everybody, data, policy, and implementation are pretty key areas for ensuring that we need to provide decentralized systems and make them more easier to access for communities that need them the most. So this is a question that is for everybody. We'll start with data, because data seems to be really the piece that unlocks all of these other components when it comes to funding and implementation, and is such an important consideration to doing any of this. If we don't know where we're going to work, how are we going to work there? We don't know the effectiveness of the technology and the decentralized technology. How are we going to even scale it? So as data remains a critical issue in understanding the true scope of WASH challenges, Canada, the US, Australia, and other nations regularly have data gaps when it comes to WASH access. What are some of the potential solutions? Alistair, you've already noted a few of them. Ted, you've noted a few of them as well, both from the government, but also from domestic WASH sectors and organizations within those sectors that can close these data gaps. And Alistair, I don't know if you'd like to start.
I guess I'll just say very briefly, picking up on the point Ted made, I think it's unfortunate that we need to collect more data on this, but we do. And so I think for the time being, the work you're doing sounds great as far as trying to push the census to get some of these questions back at it. So I'd say that would, I'll give a short answer now and happy to come back later after others weigh in, but I think kind of big picture, that'd be one of the most immediate couple things.
Is that all right? Also, too, I think, we are working on some federal pieces of legislation. You mentioned the Safe Drinking Water Information, SIDWIS. We think that EPA should be empowered and funded to collect this data as well. I mean, maybe once every 5 years. So we do have a couple of pieces of legislation in the hopper. We think EPA would be the right federal agency, maybe to partner with Commerce between the decennial census and working with them on the American Community Survey. We were able to find some questions on the housing survey back in 2012. But we think that, at least on the federal side, EPA would be, we think the right agency to help collect some of that data too, and it could feed up from counties and states. You make another point too, when we talk about the infrastructure law, we are part of the Biden administration's Closing the Wastewater Gap. It's in a select number of states. It's a federal interagency partnership with NGOs and others. But when they say $55 billion for water was invested, we have to remember, as Kabir said, that $55 billion predominantly went to states and people on utilities. It did not go to people not on a utility. I think we have to also remember that fact. When we hear $55 billion for water, it sounds, oh great, all Americans are getting this. The majority of Americans are, but not the millions of people. So when we hear $55 billion for water, who is it getting to and where?
Yeah, maybe collecting data is important, but it also, the data need to be used. It needs to get to the right places to make sure it translates into policy. For example, the US is leading in maybe data, academic articles on homeless people. The US is leading, but as we are sitting here, I don't hear anyone talking about sanitation or sanitation technologies for homeless people because they can't afford to pay. They don't have the money to pay. So all that data is there. The academic evidence is there that homeless people need sanitation, but that is not being used.
Sure. I mean, I think from the data perspective, I mean, there's a few things that jump out. I mean, like I mentioned, with traditional septic system things have been done the same way for a very long time. And so this is very a specific point, but we've been seeing this, like at the state level, there's requirements on the wastewater side. And in like for Hawaii, for instance, you have to have a system that treats 200 gallons per bedroom. So, you're having these homes, and a typical single family home is gonna be like 150 to 200 gallons per bedroom. And so it's just like, well, you're requiring these people that don't have money already to install a system that's 4 times too big. It's just a tax directly on the homeowner. And so there seems like there's very clear opportunity to gather data to like re-look at these at a state level and even at a national level to like look at these numbers. They're very specific. They will lead to lower cost systems.
To the US is in the US context, very good at collecting data, right? We have the mechanisms, we have so many different agencies that are doing multi-year studies, multi-year surveys on understanding these pieces. But as any person that is an implementer to a researcher in the room, unless we fully understand the scope of the project and the problem rather, and have a dedicated stream of data that is actually collecting the scope of the issue, any solutions that come from here are really going to just be shouting against a wall, right? We need to be able to prove to so many folks, and in conversations that we've had in Capitol Hill and other places, having that data already at the ready, what an economic impact looks like, what health impacts look like, the considerations and overlap with communities like in-housed, and the point of view that data is important from private companies, brings together a really great course to build a foundation around unlocking solutions, unlocking funding from there. Thank you all. Let's segue a bit into the policy side of things. Overall, there's no silver bullet policy to ensuring that wash beyond centralized systems can be provided everywhere. What has been, this is for all of our panelists, and Ted, I'm going to start with you here, but what has been your experience working with communities in development of some of the novel solutions that currently exist to provide, for example, in RCAP's case, greater TA and new access to communities that could be looked upon as shining examples for governments to start adopting or scaling in other contexts, nationwide or internationally?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we're in all 50 states. Last year alone, our CAP assisted about 2,000 small and rural communities across our country. The average MHI of the communities we've assisted was about $36,000, and the average population size was about 1,600. So when we're talking rural, it's the rural of the rural. Where our providers have really tried to work with homeowners, I mean, we also assist utilities too, so we try to serve, where the need is. But like you said, traditional septic systems aren't always the magic bullet, so we really try to connect. And that was something too on the policy side, that having a third party, when you're working with vulnerable populations, they don't know where to start. I mean, and we were trying to estimate the cost. What is the average cost of a septic system in the United States? Just trying to get that data, because we're trying to work on a program to be able to try to help low-income homeowners finance this to provide subsidies for you all and your organizations. But I think it's just sort of sometimes a lack of knowing what's out there. And so we've been really trying to at least allow federal money too for loans and for sub-grants for homeowners on. So I think it's also an education thing. What is out there technology-wise and solutions-based that goes just beyond the traditional septic system, right? Because the septic system industry has a lobby group in DC, like everybody else, utility groups. So, we are also hearing voices and we try to partner with them, but there are groups that are still pushing traditional, septic systems and traditional wells. And so how do we partner with those groups too? I think those groups, a lot of them are getting into innovative technologies too. So we really try to meet a community or a homeowner where they're at. And so our assistance is free to the community and the homeowner because we are federally supported. So we do a lot of work with that community or that homeowner on assessing their options, trying to figure out A, what their problem is, and then B, trying to hopefully be able to find either a company and it's another group that's able to provide the. And so we've had a harder time finding, especially as he mentioned, the smaller you get, the smaller the scale, and a lot of times the higher the cost, and then we're not able to do that. But we really have to try to meet a homeowner where they're at. And that's why a lot of these federal policies that a homeowner can work through a nonprofit. A nonprofit can help provide the financing. So there's sort of a go-between and be able to provide longer-term assistance. And how do you maintain your system, right? We can build you something new, Field of Dreams, right? You can build it and they might come, but they could leave. And so that's O&M in a nutshell too, right? And SRFs and other things, federal money can't fund O&M. It can fund infrastructure, federal dollars can fund a brand new septic system, but you have to be able to help that homeowner or help that utility be able to maintain it. So it's just one of the many challenges we have, but we're able to provide that service to homeowners, but it's a longer term thing. And so just education at all levels, both homeowner, county, states, even all the way up to Capitol Hill, education on all those technologies and those solutions. So,
Yeah, thanks. I guess just add a few things, or just kind of some thoughts. So one, working with a lot of smaller rural utilities, they're the ones we work with, they're doing the best they can, and that's usually not enough. And so I think part of it, and this is outside my area of expertise, so just my personal opinion, but I think the kind of fantasy of the full cost recovery model for a lot of small rural utilities just doesn't make sense. And I think it's already not even in practice now, because they're year to year finding different ways to patch their finances with different funding mechanisms that, you know, Ted would know a lot more about than I do. So I think that's kind of more a systemic issue of expectations, and maybe kind of broader thinking about how subsidies should be better allocated for small rural utilities. Just because on the face of it, you have lower population densities, but you have all this infrastructure that needs to be maintained. On the for rural households that are not connected to utilities, so I know Virginia Tech manages the cooperative extension program for our state, and one of the services offered is subsidized well water testing, and I think that's a great service, and a lot of households in Virginia take advantage of it. But looking at the data, and Erin Lang, the woman who runs this program, has looked at this data, it skews higher SES, the households that take advantage of that. And so we, for all of our studies, we do water testing, and we share the results with the households, and it's free. And we see that as one of the reasons households are interested in participating for free water testing. So that also seems like, you know, again, not my area as far as the policy and the finance, but it seems like that would be at least one pathway, providing not just subsidized, but free well water testing, especially targeted to lower income households. I think that would be a big help. On the sanitation side, so again, sorry, I keep focusing on where we're doing our research, but that's the area I know best, but Appalachia, Central Appalachia especially, there are a lot of areas where it's traditional septic is, even if you had the money, it's just not gonna work because you just don't have the land for it, or it's, karst topography. And so utilities there already have a number of creative systems like step septic systems that seem to be working. But I think on the financial side, another aspect is, and this goes back to data, there are some households that still have straight pipes. So literally just pipe, there's no treatment. And a lot of Department of Environmental Quality and others, they know more or less where these households are, but there's equity considerations as well, because you can't tell them to spend more than their annual income on a system that they may or may not even be able to put in because of where they live. So I think again, it gets back to kind of more kind of systemic issues. So.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I feel so out of water here. In my work with homeless people in the last 6 months and maybe in the last year, I feel like I'm in despair. Although I've got all this data, how do I pitch it to my local authority that this is a big problem? It needs attention. How do I even do that, little me? So sometimes I think we do a lot of academic work, we put a lot of effort into it, and then when we finish, it just goes on the shelf because it is really difficult I've got no solutions to offer. The homeless people themselves know what they want. They know that they are being marginalized, but advocating for the homeless people is a big thing. And I think in the UK at the moment, there is a lack of those groups advocating for homeless people, and the call for public toilets and the fight for public toilets is very much fragmented. For example, like wheelchair disabled people have fought for access to public spaces, and then you see everywhere there's wheelchair disabled access, and on paper the government can put and say that we have considered disabled people and they've been included in public spaces, and then people with celiac diseases have fought for space and then they've been given a key to say, if you go to the bus station, use your key, you can access the bathroom. So it's very much fragmented. So maybe the solution for cities, maybe in high-income countries such as the UK, maybe is for all these people to get together and speak with one voice. And then that's where we can have like inclusive cities. So maybe for me, that would be a start.
I have lots of thoughts on policies and regulations. One, I mean, I think we're seeing also at the same time, when you look at wastewater, there's the human health perspective and there's environmental health perspective as well. And I think there's a lot of push on the environmental health, which is great. So like in the Chesapeake Bay where we work, they have a ton of problems with nutrient runoff into the bay. And so any new system that you install has to have 50%, at least 50% nitrogen removal. That's awesome. But what that means for the homeowner is now, instead of a traditional septic, they had to put in an advanced system, which means it's going to be 3 to 4x the cost. And there should be some thought in terms of like these environmental policies overlapping with access policies. Same thing in Hawaii, they banned all cesspools by 2050. That's awesome. It's killing the reefs. But now it's on some of these poor homeowners to like upgrade their cesspool, and they don't have any options. They're anywhere close to reasonably priced. A larger implementation issue is just regulation. Like I said, we're working like with new innovation that's outside of, septic has been done traditionally for so long, and that includes in the Department of Health. So we're working in Virginia. The Department of Health has been great working with us, but their hands are tied in so many ways because they've done the same thing for so long. And this is where all these things marry to when you start to think about like, we can't have systems that go on the ground for 30 years and you don't think about them ever. And that's the way the Department of Health has had to work. And when you put yourself in their position, they're like, hey, I gotta think that I'm not gonna see this thing again for 30 years. And that's not fair. Like, we need to think about how operation and maintenance and service plans go with that. So I think what's really needed is, from the regulatory standpoint, we were talking about this last night, a national guideline that states can point to of like, okay, what systems are available, and this would also go along with certification, so they have some roadmap, and they can always add to it to see what their options are in terms of permitting and looking towards innovative systems, because every state I talk to is like, well, what state's doing it well? Because no one wants to be first, especially from a regulatory standpoint, so I think there's so much potential there to really start streamlining things.
Absolutely. And I'll just add in to wrap up our policy side of things. So much critical information, I think, just conveyed here today. So I just thank you to our panelists. I want to wrap up the section really quickly with just what I'm hearing from everybody that's spoken so far and what we've been considering as part of the overall policy environment are three sort of fundamentals of dedication. One, as Alistair was alluding to earlier, dedicated data collection as a critical element, as a critical policy solution to unlocking so many solutions, implementation. A lot of the challenges that were expressed earlier are going to be affected by data concerns and equity concerns. Dedicated funding streams, obviously very critical. Like we mentioned throughout, there is historic funding, there's, in consideration of Congress, what are called earmarks or congressionally directed spending, in which communities have to advocate for themselves to be able to get that funding, and then it's a small pool of funding that they have to compete for every year, and it's very tiny. So we need dedicated funding streams to be able to apply these technologies, apply these solutions to communities that need them the most. And the third is dedicated collective action. I think what we heard, and particularly here towards the end, communities, sorry, I thought that was the bell for lunch, but we've still got a couple minutes left, so I'm trapping you here. Dedicated collective action, because at the end of the day, as Ted was mentioning earlier, there are strong lobbying arms for private industry or for various different organizations, but communities themselves don't necessarily have a strong lobbying arm. They don't have a strong advocacy component, and it's going to take organizations like ours, coalitions like ours, collectives like the Vessel Collective here in the US to come together and really bring in that collective voice, whether it's for unhoused communities in the UK, whether it's for Indigenous and rural communities here in the US, or any marginalized, disadvantaged, or community that's been left behind internationally, and particularly in higher income nations. So if you work in the international context and will live in a high income nation and maybe haven't thought about what's happening in your own backyards, I'm not saying stop looking at what you're doing internationally, but start considering also what's happening within your own borders as well. We have just a couple of minutes, and I apologize. We had an extra little bit of a break time between the 10 o'clock session and the 11 o'clock session. I think we can take about 2 rapid fire questions. We'll see 2 right here.
Thanks very much. Really interesting panel discussion. Jo Ellis, I'm from Lixil Public Partners. On the matter of data collection, is there something that we can learn from the international WASH sector around data sharing in a more informalized sense, not from the point of view of the regulator requiring us to collect that data or through going through the peer review process to get published journal articles? So for example, in the humanitarian context where they have clusters that have formalized approaches to collecting and sharing data across projects, across entities. Like we're working in lots of different places across this country on a project by project sense. Is there a way that we could share that data whilst becoming a more formalized sector? Thanks.
And I'm going to just collect the questions now and let the panelists go through them as they will. So the second question as well.
Mark Sopsa, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. First is a question about practice, and that is, as already alluded to in this session so far, this one in the earlier phase of it, there's no monitoring and evaluation of on-site systems. That means no data are routinely collected. In the USA, just states for wells and other on-site systems are left to the homeowner. Same thing with monitoring the performance of on-site septic systems as along with wells. There's no ongoing, shall we say, monitoring and surveillance of those systems. That's a huge gap. It's not addressed by EPA. It's often not addressed by many states, and it's an unmet need. The other is a research point, and that is there have been until recently, no randomized controlled trials of the water from private groundwater wells in the United States. The only trial that's being done now is by Heather Murphy, and she's doing it in Pennsylvania. It's the first one of its kind. That's a huge research gap. We need to understand what the disease burden is from these private wells. And there are going to be a lot of systems that may vary depending upon geographic location and other factors. And having only one study being done at present and none prior means that in the research arena, we have a huge gap.
Absolutely. Thank you both for those. So to our panelists, I asked to keep answers short so we're not keeping anybody from lunch and no one punches me after the session. But we have questions around data collection, learning from the international sector, and sharing across different lenses, and then more in practice. So and the need for on-site systems, as well as research on private wells and understanding health impacts. So Tate, do you want to start, and then we'll just go down the line?
Sure, I'll just answer the second question. Answer might be, but I mean, I agree. So the monitoring and evaluation piece is very tricky, especially as we start thinking about like we have systems that are taking septic tank effluent to water reuse standards, and so we want to be able to reuse it for irrigation, toilet flushing. I think it's going to be incredibly important. But how do you do that from M&E standpoint where it's not cost prohibitive to the homeowner? Because like I said earlier, commercial scale systems, it's much easier to have an online turbidity sensor, for instance, to see how the system's performing, but you can't put a $10,000 sensor on a home. Advanced treatment systems, they do come with, a lot of them come with service contracts where they are monitoring and at least sampling a couple times a year. So ideally we start to head towards that model where you have a service contract with any system that is going to be monitored at least twice a year.
Just to the gentleman from Chapel Hill's point about it's on the Wild West, right? Wells and septic aren't part of the Safe Drinking Water Act or Clean Water Act. We're asking just for some data. But there's been ideas out there that you could add some monitoring and reviewing requirements to SIDWA and to Clean Water Act. You could also make some changes to the SRFs. States get 80% of the money from Treasury as in a form of a cap grant. You could make some changes to the intended use plan to address wells and septic, but we know some of the groups that would potentially fight against that. But we have been, at least at our CAP, we have been trying to propose some solutions, at least on the data side. We think we can at least make some gains there. Larger, longer term questions. How do we address these gaps? I really think wells should be, some components should be added to the Safe Drinking Water Act, and on the decentralized side, Clean Water Act. And that will take Congress to make those changes.
Do you want to respond at all, Grace?
Yeah, no, sorry, I didn't know.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. So briefly on the standardized data collection. So I think, so myself and some others, most of my background was LMICs and more recently the last 5+ years have been very focused on working in the States. And I think it's interesting, we often feel like there's much better monitoring data, surveillance data in a lot of LMICs compared to right here. So I think that's a challenge. It's great to know again, Ted, what RCAP's doing to try to push that. I will say one thing to that. So for now, there's been a push for most federally funded research, especially from NIH, that unless you have a very good reason not to, that the data should be made public. So it's not necessarily standardized, and that's a challenge too, that a lot of us were asking the same questions in different ways, and so there are potentially issues there marrying the data, but at least I think more and more it's going to be in the public domain, and that sets it up so people can do kind of meta-analysis studies to look at trends across studies. Totally agree, Mark, about the need for more M&E for on-site systems. Also, I'm very excited about Heather's study. And I'll say, so we've been working, we have a couple pilot RCT studies also focused on wells, targeted to lower income households. And I wish you were on the NIH review panel that will be looking at that. But we're hopeful that we'll be able to start doing that work, but we're waiting to see if we can get it funded. But yeah, agreed, it's a surprising data gap. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, give a huge round of applause for our incredible panelists here today. I'm going to ask our panelists from the first round and second round to stick around for a quick photo. Everybody else, please head to lunch, stick around for the afternoon keynote, and check out the many incredible presentations that are happening this afternoon. For more high-income country discussions. Thank you all. Can I take a photo? Yeah, we'll go from